Hi there, my name is Richy Srirachanikorn. I'm a sociologist at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. I'm presenting this research on behalf of my research collaborator, Rowena Chodkowski, also at Concordia University, and um, we both presented and researched this exact topic at the Musical Retrofuturism 3.0 Symposium that happened online August 28th to 29th. And this is a sort of recap of that talk. And so, first and foremost, we're both a part of and co-founders of the NOSTAGAIN Network, North America's largest and first student-led research collective studying what we call generative nostalgia. So instead of looking at nostalgia as a sort of backwards-facing thing or an artifact of the past, we're studying how we can use nostalgia to draw our hopes and dreams from the past, and how do people implement that today? How do they incorporate that, draw from that well? And we have sort of a symposium every year, so check that out if you're interested. But first and foremost, when someone says they're nostalgic for the quote old future, what exactly are they talking about? It's interesting that one can even be nostalgic for the future, right? As Johannes Hofer, the medical student who first coined the term, used to describe soldiers who reported pains the longer they spent time away from their hometown and loved ones. And so Hofer combined the Greek nostos, which is return home, and algos, which is ache or pain. But what is nostalgia today but a pain to even define, least of all for its relationship with home? Sociologist Janelle Wilson writes that, quote, in this postmodern multicultural time, home has become a problematic concept, unquote. And so, for one, digital technologies have made it possible for users to self identify with more than one place and time. For example, the Maldives is my dream home. Scotland is my ancestral home, despite being born in Canada. And World of Warcraft, the guild is my family because it's my virtual home. And so for Svetlana Boym, digital technologies, particularly the internet, gives us access to what she calls possibility spaces. Yet soon enough, we realize that we can't be everywhere at once. This leaves us feeling chronophobia, which is not a fear of time, but Boym defines it as the anxiety of wanting to get in touch with as many homes, as many things and places that we call nostalgic, all at once. When I am here, I am missing there, but also when I'm there, I'm missing here. And so, unlike Hofer's original idea that nostalgia is a return to home in the present, Boym's chronophobia is the algos, the ache, that arises even when we have returned home. To complicate this relationship with place and nostalgia, Sigmund Bauman in 2017 puts us in the time that he calls the age of nostalgia. Here, Bauman described individuals as facing the task of working to achieve upward class mobility, yet at the same time, they're witnessing the precarity of social relationships. There are a lack of public spaces to reliably establish and find community, and they also face the competition of securing their own futures. How similar does that sound to today? How can I work for the collective tomorrow if I'm still unsure about having enough money for my dinner tonight? And so, to recap so far, Boym says that we're nostalgic because digital technology reminds us of the past that we lived and the past that we could have lived. Bauman, on the other hand, argues that digital technology makes us nostalgic because it surveils us, it breaks up communities, it prevents us from having long lasting relationships, it keeps us hustling, it reminds us of those with more than us, LinkedIn, for example, right? And so, under these conditions that he calls liquid modernity, nostalgia is not about chasing possibility, like Boym says, but is a response to the impossibility of dreaming or even returning anywhere. And so Bauman says that the true point of nostalgia's return, the ultimate return, is not the past, but a return to, quote, day one on earth before I learned how not to be enough, unquote. The Nostos here is no longer a return to the present for Hofer, or a return to lived or possible pasts per Boym. For Bauman, It's a return to the moment before we even became what we are today. Yet for those of us who have pasts and dreams for the future, what the heck should we do? Sociologist Fred Davis in 1973 compared nostalgia to that of a friendly bank loan officer who supplies individuals with tokens to cash in later. Sort of that if you're going to have a long life ahead of you full of things that Bauman calls liquid modernity or Boyne calls chronophobia, right? All these struggles and hiccups forward. Nostalgia is that thing that you cash in later on, that you can look back despite all these wounds and pains, and you say, you know what? I came a long way. I should be proud of myself. And so that makes sense for the individual to use nostalgia as a coping mechanism. Yet Davis also stressed that nostalgia, quote, expects a return in the investment, unquote. What exactly does that mean? If we look to Boehm, she calls these tokens restorative nostalgia, which is a reimagined version of the past that makes it seem like the past can be brought back exactly like the way it was. Let me give you a few examples. Social institutions who make claims about the past, or according to Davis's metaphor, the bank. Simon Reynolds in 2010 looks at fashion companies that release, quote, vintage or 90s clothes, when in fact, these clothing lines don't represent the fashion actually how it was at the time, but only the impression of what the 90s looked like or could have looked like. Tanner in 2023 finds that media companies prevent people from accessing, editing, or parodying their films. Yet this means that these films that are preserved and later on represent cinematic history, they create a nostalgia because companies tell us that they're old, that they're valuable, that they're important. Yet nobody alive remembers why it's important. They don't remember watching, critiquing, mixing and matching with it, right? It's sort of people are distanced away from the past that they could live to the past that they're told that, you know what, despite not having lived it, you wished that you could have lived it, right? There's a distance there that we just take their word for it. And Cross finds that adult consumers will continue to buy commodities that they grew up using, even if these products are not the original or authentic. As long as they look like what they remember using, they're happy to chase what Cross calls consumed nostalgia. And so here we see through fashion, media, and even toys that social institutions, the bank, bring back a nostalgia based on the past, not for the way it was, but for the past the way it could have been, right? Per Boehm, this nostalgia, this past is restored, only its essentials, but not returned to. And so for Bauman, all of this means one thing, that the past is no longer a reliable source of nostalgia. Yes, we're all perfectly rich with personal memories and nostalgia, but at the same time, we're all broke on the resources to actualize this past for the way it was and the way we wish it could still be. So that if we can't look back at the past, because companies have claimed versions of it now, then can we look to the future instead? In the early 2000s to mid 2010s, tech companies offered the vision of a world where the internet is everywhere, right? Where creativity flourished and everyone owned a portable device, sort of like a paintbrush. And most of all, humans and nature would thrive together. These products were plastered with blue skies, green hills, and tropical fish, which helped ease, quote, the arrival of smartphones, which was transforming the internet from something locked away in a computer room to a living and breathing entity, right? That's from Holiday in 2023. But years after this window into a future defined by glossy textures and vibrant color palettes and nature elements, software and hardware turned minimalistic, sleek, non-tactile, right? Where's the home screen, home button on the iPhone these days? And instead, the technology, instead of representing an optimistic chance for people to explore and talk to one another, are used to surveil people, right? That break down communities. And so here, the tech no longer accommodated the users, appearing nice and easy to use, but users now had to accommodate themselves to use all these techs, right? To find the life, the color in all these soulless capitalist mobilization technologies. And so for folks who feel nostalgic for the time before this change, They refer to the period of glossy, saturated, skeuomorphic technologies and the world as Frutiger Aero. And I'm going to pronounce it as Frutiger, even though some pronounce it as Frutiger. Yes. A quick Google search for this term shows market pages, right? Social media videos, and even a wiki that redefines Frutiger Aero from a retrofuturism, a future that was promised in the past, to a retro object of the 2000s to 2010s. In other words, Frutiger Aero once represented the future that we grew up wanting, but because it never actualized, it's a future that is trapped in the past. Yet companies in their restorative nostalgia erase this broken promise, and they say that, guess what? Frutiger Aero now represents the past that happened, which those of us who lived through it know it never did. The future never came. And so earlier we saw how fashion, media, and film companies use restorative nostalgia to culturally reimagine the past. Pickering and Keightley call this branded reimagination retrotyping. And retrotyping changes the nostalgic object itself. Instead of a past that is built on one's personal, authentic, and lived nostalgia, the past or home can now be substituted for anything that looks like it. And so today, glossy tropical fish, blue skies, green hills, all of these products are retrotyped as emblems of the past in the 2000s to 2010s, right? And so with Bowman's liquid modernity and Boehm's chronophobia, consumers give into these commodified nostalgias. They accept the restorative nostalgia because they risk losing more time if they try to pursue the original stuff or if they try to actualize this glossy, saturated futures alone, right? So they accept the fact that fine, they represent a better past. Yet what makes Frutiger Aero interesting for us is that the nostalgia for it is mischaracterized from a longing of a retrofuturism that never happened to an old thing that happened in the 2000s in the past. This leaves some users to feel what Bowman calls retrotopia. And retrotopias are, quote, a diffident, dejected, and defeatist, unquote, attitude towards the future, as opposed to a utopia that Bowman calls positive, boisterous, assertive, right? The energy is gone. Because this glossy, saturated future never arrived, consumers look at Frutiger Aero today as what Bowman calls an undead past that lingers instead of an exciting future full of possibilities and novelty, right? Put simply, retrotopias are futures that carry the baggage of institutional distrust, betrayal, and lost time. It is more algos than nostos, right? And so to better understand how users deal or even talk about Frutiger Aero today, we decided to look at YouTube for three main reasons. Number one, we argue that YouTube accommodates one nostalgia for lived and possible pasts. If we go back to Boehm's idea of chronophobia, sort of the anxiety of not being able to experience all the homes we have, then YouTube offers an antidote for that. We tried searching up the term the 2000s on YouTube, and of course, there is not a single dominant prescriptive idea of what that looked like. Instead, there are multiple hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of videos that serve as accounts which contest, support, and redefine what the 2000s was. Specifically inside each video, users can hash this out a bit more, right? Through the comments, the dislike ratios, and even other suggested videos on the side. And so nobody has to stick to one prescriptive way of what the past was. This follows what sociologist Barbara Adam calls social time, or, quote, the material expressions of temporality, the consensus being the social equivalent to the trees or the rings in a tree trunk, unquote. Great quote. Users can upload their own perspectives of the past, right? So that the nostalgic person who may be suffering from chronophobia can see that actually the 2000s was not all good and old. Frutiger Aero might be retrotyped as the nostalgic 2000s and 2010s, but comments and videos and dislike ratios and all this stuff reminds people that this period of time also suffered 9/11, SARS, the 2008 financial crisis, and even Ebola, right? And so in one example, a comment underneath a video essay about Frutiger Aero writes that, as a kid, this is how the world felt. The screensavers everywhere, bank lobbies, when I was waiting for my mom. A lot of people had their bathrooms themed this way. We never called it Frutiger Aero. It was just our reality, and we thought that's what our future would feel like. But we were wrong. Here, users who lived through the 2000s or were born long after it both feel anemoa, a new word that describes a nostalgia for a time one has never lived through. For example, Gen Alpha, who didn't live through the 2000s, Frutiger Aero might represent a time where technologies carried the optimism and the interests of humans in nature. But Gen Z, who did live through this time, reminds them that, quote, they were wrong. The world felt this way, but it wasn't lived this way, right? The world of Frutiger Aero, the future that was promised to them, was only played in the speakers of the lobbies or plastered in the bathroom walls or hovering around in people's screensavers. In other words, the train to the future never arrived, only its bell. Another example where YouTube helps address chronophobia is in this particular comment thread here, where a user says, "Oh, this aesthetic reminds me of home." And then quickly another person expanded and says, "This reminded them of getting an iPod Touch for Christmas when they were 9 and being overjoyed, like a whole new world opened up to them." Here is an expansion of home that companies have retrotyped with a uniform aesthetic. That home or the 2000s looked just like a glossy, saturated past, that this happened. Yet instead, we are given what Catherine and Niemeyer calls digital nostalgia, where it's a longing of not just the media content of the machines, but also the human relations around it. YouTube allows for this rearticulation of home, which underscores the social attitudes people had, right? Sort of that new world opened up to me, and the relationships that the technology represented and brought. Instead of reinforcing the fact that Frutiger Aero is a cool and old past, these comments break down and highlight that it was a cool, near future, right? That the old, what is sold as the old now, was always and is still about the new, the future that has yet to come. Second, YouTube unites Bauman's competitive, burnt out, and distrustful individuals because it emphasizes the sonic dimensions of nostalgia, leading to what we call a collective comfort. Now, YouTube is, of course, the world's largest video streaming platform, over 1 billion videos uploaded a day, and millions of hours of videos being watched daily too. Yet it also gives people the chance to speak, right, via comments, videos, reels, etc., about the past the way it was lived. Michael Jacobson, who studied with Bauman, writes that nostalgia is defined in, quote, the eye of the beholder. Yet here, YouTube allows Frutiger Aero to be redefined by the voice of those who try to hold onto this nostalgic future. Even scholars ourselves, we all tend to fixate on the visual form of nostalgia, right? Fashions, films, movies, commodities, what we just talked about earlier. They're all examples of nostalgias as defined in the eye of the beholder. But the past consists of sound too. Adam Lanza in 2004 stresses the cultural significance of background music. Music and soundtracks that lingered in our office spaces, airplanes, malls, and just everyday settings that seemed unlikely to become warm objects of our nostalgia today. Frutiger Aeros are filled with music from these environments. Behind the compilations of screensavers, computers, and tropical fish products, the real constant is the video game music from the mid-2000s, which accompanies these Frutiger Aero videos that go from 15 minutes to tens of hours. The interesting thing to note here is that without a dominant visual form, users can begin re-envisioning the past that they lived through in the comment section. And what emerges here is a sort of collective comfort, right, that goes against Bauman's liquid modernity and the challenges it faces. And so one user wrote, I know it's not good to live in the past too much and all that crap, but F it. I miss the exaggerated, goofy, charismatic, and colorful designs of everything, whether it was technology, fast food chains, stores in general, consoles, you name it. If capitalism is going to consume us, it might as well do it with style. Holy moly, that's a retrotopia. The sounds that brought back, quote, fast food chains, stores in general to this person's digital nostalgia also invites other people to reevaluate what these places mean for them today. Yes, McDonald's may be a factory of Boehm's restorative nostalgia, right? Its fries taste the same everywhere and every year. Customers seek out happy meals since then and even now. And its worldwide presence guarantees it a spot in our personal and cultural pasts. It's inevitable that McDonald's will make up the past and the nostalgia that we all feel. Yet this music that sounds like Frutiger Aero and is paired with images of McDonald's back then can redefine its position today. Quote, the goofy, charismatic, and colorful designs of McDonald's back then is, of course, still a force of capitalism, right? It's still a business then and now. But it was less efficient, less minimalist, and less soulless, right? It was more colorful, more playful, and more customer friendly. This background music brings people together despite the tiredness and separation that they feel under liquid modernity. And this music sort of lets people redefine and see what we now view as the emblem of a capitalist production machine, right? All these sleek, modern, non-tactile technologies that dominate McDonald's storefronts today. Everything is operated by the individual with kiosk stands, automatic designs, etc. No life. The music takes us back to a time before this period for us to sort of rejoice in that comfort of growing up together, even though it's gone today, right? And so nostalgia here acts in a sort of coping mechanism, which Jacobson says helps people achieve control and to slow down life. It's not just a retreat to the past, but it's a sort of looking for resources to make the present, as foreign as it feels now, familiar again. And so third and finally, Frutiger Aero videos are sites of what we call generative nostalgia, and we'll get to defining that. So far, we argued that YouTube allows users to listen to other people's lived and possible pasts, right? These comments break down the cultural imagination that retrotypes Frutiger Aero as an object of the past. Then, we pointed to the role of Frutiger Aero music in its videos, which can trigger nostalgic atmospheres that people lived through. By recounting these places in its older form, users can notice what is different with its present form today. And so this sort of sonic dimension of nostalgia generates insights and even critique about what was lost, yet also a speculation about what we could still gain in the future. Let's see this in action. The year is 2045. Cities are modern and clean. Lobbies and office buildings are filled with vibrant green plants and deep arrow blue floors and walls. Technology is advanced, but only used for medical and scientific purposes and not for spying on us. Music, movies, and video games are fun and made from passion and not copy and pasted. We are all happier. Another user also uses a mirror of Frutiger Aero's past into what we could still have in the future. And they say, Frutiger Aero isn't about the forever wars, the housing crisis, the recession, the Columbia disaster, or anything like that. It's about the future we were promised in the 2000s, where every city is Dubai without the slavery, where every beach is the Bahamas without the garbage, where we get our mass solar power without all the poisoned drinking water. What these examples show us is a case of nostalgia that is generative. If we look back to one of Boehm's pieces in 2007, she argued that nostalgia is prospective and not regressive. The reason why Rowena and I chose the term generative is that we wanted to highlight the creativity, but also the production of things attitudes, social action that comes from claims about the past. Yes, companies that profit from consumers with restorative nostalgia produce a nostalgia that's regressive because it keeps the individual unfulfilled, inaccessible to the past, and trapped in Ballman's liquid modernity. It keeps us in the present. But nostalgia, regardless of the direction it takes people or whether it gets history to repeat itself, is still generative. Whether it's regressive or prospective is up to, again, what Jacobson says, the eye of the beholder, right? And so, in the case of YouTube as a site for generative nostalgia, we see that it does both regressive and prospective things. Some videos reproduce the restorative nostalgia that Frutiger Aero is a 2015's emblem of the past, right? It takes us backwards, but it doesn't actually forward the mission that Frutiger Aero represented. Yet, in one click away, another video might advance the prospective nostalgic promises that Frutiger Aero still holds, right? That out of this shared loss, this shared unrealized future, people build prospects for the future that is yet to come with the two comments before. So it does both regressive and prospective things through generation, a generation of insights, critiques, and comments. And so to conclude, we find that John Koenig's definition of anemoa, the theme of the symposium, or if we remind ourselves, the nostalgia for a time we never lived through, anemoa covers exactly the joy, the confusion, the longing that users, including us both, have felt in pursuit of this old future that Frutiger Aero represents. Now that you know the potential of generative nostalgia in Frutiger Aero videos, perhaps you may approach anemoa or the 2000s, or even how you use YouTube in a new way going forward. Let's see if we can apply anemoa to Frutiger Aero. A pang of nostalgia for a future we never lived through, longing to step through the frame into a world of black and white. But of course, to us, it wasn't all flickering silence and grainy black and white. We saw vivid color rushing in 3 dimensions. We heard voices in deafening stereo. We confronted smells we couldn't escape. For us, nothing was ever simple. None of us knew for sure what this era meant, or that it was an era to begin with. At the time, our world or our future was real. Nothing was finished and nothing was guaranteed. And so it's this sort of nostalgic forward-facing, the generativeness of nostalgia that NOSTAGAIN has been exploring and is welcoming explorations of since 2022. Every year we host a symposium that's digital and hybrid, so do join us, asking artists, scholars, practitioners. We even had a neuroscientist 2 years ago, and grief counselors as well, to share how nostalgia in their everyday lives generates things that may be hope, right, in the present, that may be a critique towards the past, or that may be, like Frutiger Aero, a path towards the future. And so that's our presentation today, Rowena and I. We'd be happy to get in contact with anybody. And we hope that we can probably see this glossy, saturated future sooner rather than later. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.